The distant thunder of hooves against the hard, packed earth was the first sign of fate's cruel joke. Fiona Montgomery froze at her wash basin, soapy hands suspended mid-air as she strained to listen. No ordinary traveler would approach her isolated homestead with such urgency. 5 years had passed since she'd last heard a horse ridden that hard toward her property, and the memory of that day still burned in her chest like a bullet wound that refused to heal. "It can't be," she whispered, drying her hands on her apron as she moved to the window. The year was 1878, and the Arizona Territory was no place for a woman alone. Yet alone she had been since that terrible day when the man she loved rode away, leaving nothing but dust clouds and hollow promises. Fiona had survived thrived through sheer determination, turning her small ranch into something that was entirely her own. The rider crested the hill, and Fiona's heart seemed to stop beating entirely. Even at this distance, she would know that silhouette anywhere. The broad shoulders, the distinctive way he sat a horse as though man and beast were one, the tilt of his hat against the setting sun. "No," she breathed, backing away from the window. "Not now, not after all this time." But there was no mistaking the figure approaching her home. Kade Blackwood had returned, and Fiona's carefully constructed world was about to shatter. She straightened her spine and smoothed her skirts, grateful that she had worn her blue dress today, the one that brought out the color of her eyes. Not that it mattered what he thought of her appearance. Not anymore. By the time Kade reached her porch, Fiona stood in the doorway, arms crossed over her chest like armor. The years had been kind to him, she noted with irritation. His face was more weathered, with fine lines at the corners of his eyes, but his jaw was still strong, his shoulders broader than she remembered. His dark hair curled beneath his hat, and those eyes, those damnable blue eyes, still pierced straight through to her soul. "Fiona," he said, her name like a prayer on his lips. "You're trespassing, Mr. Blackwood," she replied coldly. "This is my property now." He removed his hat, revealing more of that face she had once traced with her fingertips in the dark. "I know, and you've done well with it. What do you want?" Her voice didn't waver, and for that she was proud. A chance to explain. Fiona laughed, a harsh sound that held no humor. "You're 5 years too late for explanations." "Please," he said, and something in his voice, a desperation she'd never heard before, made her hesitate. "I wouldn't have come back if it wasn't important." "Important to whom, Kade? You made your choice when you rode away." She gripped the doorframe to steady herself. "The war was over. We were supposed to start a life together, but you couldn't leave the fighting behind." "I didn't have a choice." "We always have choices. You chose wrong." Fiona stepped back into her home. "There's a creek 2 miles east where you can water your horse. I suggest you use it and then keep riding." Before she could close the door, he moved forward, his boot stopping it from shutting completely. "Fiona, please." "There are things you don't know." "And things you don't know," she retorted. "Like how it feels to be abandoned, to wait months for letters that never came, to finally accept that the man you loved wasn't coming back." "I never stopped loving you," he said softly. Those words, the ones she'd longed to hear for years, now felt like salt in an open wound. Love isn't just words, Kade. It's actions. It's staying when things get hard. His eyes darkened with emotion. "I'm not asking for forgiveness. Not yet. But I am asking for a chance to tell you why I left. After that, if you still want me gone, I'll ride away and never trouble you again." Fiona studied him, searching for the lies in his face, but all she saw was exhaustion, determination, and something that looked remarkably like hope. "1 hour," she finally said. "You have 1 hour to say your piece, then you leave." Relief washed over his features. "Thank you." She stepped aside to let him enter, careful not to touch him as he passed. His familiar scent, leather, horses, and something distinctly Kade threatened to unravel her resolve. She directed him to sit at her kitchen table while she busied herself making coffee, needing the mundane task to settle her nerves. "You've made this place shine," he said, looking around at the cabin they had once planned to share. "Always knew you would." I did it without you, she reminded him, setting a steaming cup before him with more force than necessary. So talk. Explain why you left without a proper goodbye, why your promises meant nothing. Kade wrapped his hands around the mug but didn't drink. After the war, I couldn't settle. The nightmares, the memories, they followed me everywhere. I thought I could outrun them, be the man you deserved. He looked up at her, eyes haunted. But then Marshal Jenkins approached me about tracking down the Sutton gang. Fiona stiffened. The Sutton gang had terrorized the Arizona Territory for years, led by Vernon Sutton, a man as cruel as he was cunning. They were responsible for killing 12 people, including a family with children, just over the ridge from here, Kade continued. Jenkins knew my tracking skills from the war. Said I was the only one who could find them before they killed again. So you left to play hero, Fiona said bitterly. I left to keep you safe, he corrected. Sutton had a reputation for going after the families of those who hunted him. I couldn't bear the thought of him finding you because of me. Fiona's hands trembled slightly as she sat across from him. You could have told me. Would you have let me go? She looked away. They both knew the answer. I planned to be gone 3 months at most. Find the gang, bring them to justice, come home to you. His voice grew strained. But Sutton was smarter than we anticipated. He led us deep into Comanche territory where we lost his trail. By the time we picked it up again, 6 months had passed. You could have written. I did. His gaze locked with hers. I wrote every week. When I finally made it to a town where I could send them, I dispatched 20 letters at once. Fiona shook her head in confusion. I never received any letters. I found out later that Sutton had men watching the mail routes. They intercepted anything addressed to you. Kade reached into his coat and withdrew a bundle tied with string. I kept writing anyway, hoping that someday I could give these to you myself. She stared at the stack of letters, their edges worn from being carried for years. Her fingers itched to reach for them, to devour the words she had longed for, but pride kept her hands in her lap. It took 2 years to finally corner Sutton's gang in New Mexico territory, Kade continued. We captured most of them, but Sutton escaped. I couldn't come back while he was still free. The danger to you was too great. So what changed? Fiona asked. Why are you here now? 3 weeks ago, we finally caught him. Vernon Sutton is dead. The finality in Kade's voice sent a chill down her spine. It's over. The territory is safer now. And you expect me to welcome you back with open arms, to pretend those 5 years of loneliness never happened? Kade shook his head. I expect nothing. I only wanted you to know the truth. The truth, she repeated. The truth is you made a decision about our future without consulting me. You decided I was better off believing you had abandoned me rather than giving me the choice to wait for you or not. I was wrong, he admitted, surprising her. I thought I was protecting you, but I ended up hurting you instead. That's something I'll have to live with for the rest of my days. Fiona stood abruptly, needing distance from the sincerity in his voice. Your hour is nearly up. There's one more thing. Kade reached into his pocket and withdrew a small object, placing it on the table between them. I've carried this every day since I left. Fiona's breath caught. It was her mother's wedding ring, the one she had given him before he rode away, promising to wear it around his neck until they could be properly married. I never broke that promise, he said softly. It's been with me through everything, a reminder of what I was fighting to return to. She stared at the simple gold band, memories flooding back of the night she had placed it in his palm, of the vows they had whispered under the stars, of the future they had planned. I should go, Kade said, rising from his chair. He placed his hat on his head, nodded once, and moved toward the door. Fiona remained frozen, torn between the anger she had nursed for years and the undeniable truth in his eyes. As his hand reached for the doorknob, something broke loose inside her. Wait. He turned, hope and wariness battling in his expression. The letters, she said. Leave them. I want to read them. A small smile touched his lips. They're yours, always have been. And where will you go now? There's a place in town where I can stay tonight after that. He shrugged. I haven't thought that far ahead. Fiona nodded. not trusting herself to say more. "Goodbye, Fiona." The finality in his voice made her heart constrict. As he stepped onto the porch, the setting sun cast long shadows across the land they had once planned to share. She watched him mount his horse, the practiced ease of his movements still familiar after all these years. "Kade," she called out before she could stop herself. He looked back, waiting. "The creek water isn't good this time of year. There's a well behind the house." It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't an invitation to stay, but it was something a tiny crack in the wall she had built around her heart. "Thank you," he said, understanding the gesture for what it was. As he rode toward the well, Fiona closed the door and leaned against it, clutching the bundle of letters to her chest. She had lived with anger for so long, it had become a companion, filling the empty space he had left behind. Now, faced with the truth, she didn't know what to feel anymore. One thing was certain: Kade Blackwood's return had stirred up everything she had fought to bury. Whether that was a curse or a blessing remained to be seen. Fiona sat by lamplight until well past midnight, reading Kade's letters one by one. His words painted a vivid picture of a man torn between duty and desire, haunted by the violence he witnessed, yet driven by the need to make the world safer for those he loved. For her. In one letter, dated nearly 4 years ago, he wrote, "The stars are brilliant tonight, like diamonds scattered across black velvet. They remind me of the night we lay in the meadow and you pointed out constellations I'd never noticed before. You taught me to see beauty in the darkness, Fiona. I carry that lesson with me through this long night, hoping dawn will bring me back to you." Tears blurred her vision as she reached the final letter, written just weeks ago. "It's finished. After all this time, I can finally come home if home will still have me. I harbor no illusions that you've waited, or that I deserve your forgiveness. But I need to see your face one more time to tell you the truth, to give you these letters that hold pieces of my soul. Then, if you wish it, I will disappear from your life forever." Fiona folded the last letter carefully and added it to the pile. Outside, an owl hooted softly, and the wind rustled through the cottonwoods. The familiar sounds of night in the territory felt different somehow, as if the world had shifted slightly on its axis. Sleep eluded her as questions tumbled through her mind. Had she been too harsh, too quick to judge, or was she being foolish even considering that there might still be something worth salvaging between them? Morning found her red-eyed but resolved. She needed answers not just from Kade, but from others who might verify his story. After feeding her animals and changing into a fresh dress, she hitched her wagon and headed into town. Willow Creek was a small settlement, just large enough to support a general store, a saloon, a doctor's office, and a sheriff's station. It was to this last building that Fiona directed her steps. Sheriff Miller looked up from his desk as she entered, his weathered face breaking into a smile. "Miss Montgomery, what brings you into town on such a fine morning?" "Information, Sheriff," she replied directly. "About Kade Blackwood." The smile faded, replaced by something more guarded. "I heard he was back in these parts. You knew he was working with Marshal Jenkins." "Tracking the Sutton gang," Miller nodded slowly. "I did. Jenkins kept me informed when he could. Dangerous work they were doing." "Why didn't you tell me?" The hurt in her voice was impossible to disguise. "All these years, I thought he'd simply abandoned me." The sheriff sighed heavily. "It wasn't my place, Miss Montgomery. Besides, Blackwood made us all promise, said it was safer for you not to know." "Safer." She nearly spat the word. "As if I'm some delicate flower that needs protecting." "Vernon Sutton wasn't a man who showed mercy," Miller said quietly. "He killed the wife and young daughter of a deputy who was after him up in Colorado territory. Made the man watch before killing him too." He met her gaze steadily. Blackwood knew what he was risking by going after him. Fiona absorbed this information in silence, her anger giving way to a sickening understanding of what Kade had been trying to shield her from. "Is it true that Sutton is dead?" Miller nodded. "Got the telegram myself 3 weeks back. Sutton and the last of his men were cornered in a canyon." Only Blackwood and one other lawman survived the shootout. I see. Fiona twisted her hands in her skirt. And the letters, is it possible they were intercepted, as Kade claims? More than possible. Sutton was known for having men watching mail routes, gathering information. If he knew Blackwood was after him, he'd have made sure no communication got through. The sheriff leaned forward. For what it's worth, Miss Montgomery, I've known Kade Blackwood since he was a young deputy fresh from the war. He's a good man. Stubborn as a mule and too noble for his own good sometimes, but his heart's always been in the right place. Fiona thanked the sheriff and left, her mind whirling with this confirmation of Kade's story. Her next stop was the boarding house, where Mrs. Winters confirmed that, yes, Mr. Blackwood had taken a room the previous night, but had ridden out at dawn, saying he had business to attend to and would return by evening. Disappointed but determined, Fiona completed her errands in town, each interaction punctuated by curious glances and poorly concealed questions about Kade's return. By midday, she was eager to escape the gossip and headed back to her ranch. As she rounded the final bend in the road, she saw smoke rising from her chimney. For a moment, panic gripped her. Had bandits taken advantage of her absence? But then she spotted Kade's horse tethered near the barn. She approached cautiously, confusion giving way to astonishment as she drew closer to the house. The broken fence post she'd been meaning to fix for weeks had been replaced. The sagging porch step had been repaired, and from inside came the unmistakable aroma of cooking. Fiona entered her own home with the strange sensation of being a visitor. Kade stood at her stove, his shirt sleeves rolled up, stirring something in her largest pot. He turned at her entrance, a hint of uncertainty crossing his features. "I hope you don't mind," he said. "I noticed some things that needed fixing and thought I might make myself useful." "You're cooking," she stated, unable to keep the surprise from her voice. A small smile touched his lips. "The war taught me many things. How to patch wounds, track men through impossible terrain, and make a decent stew from whatever was available." He gestured to the pot. "Your garden is thriving. I hope you don't mind that I harvested some vegetables." Fiona stood in the doorway, conflicting emotions warring within her. Part of her wanted to be angry at his presumption, but another part, a part she had suppressed for years, was touched by the gesture. "I went to see Sheriff Miller," she said finally, removing her bonnet and hanging it on the hook by the door. Kade's hands stilled momentarily before resuming their task. "And," he confirmed, "your story, about Sutton, about the letters." She moved further into the room, watching him carefully. "Why didn't you tell anyone else what you were doing, Mrs. Peterson at the general store, the Wilsons at the livery? They all thought you'd just run off. They pitied me." Pain flashed across his face. "The fewer people who knew, the safer you were. Sutton had eyes and ears everywhere." He turned to face her fully. "I'm sorry for the pain it caused you, Fiona. If I could go back and do things differently." "What would you change?" she challenged. He considered her question seriously. "I would have found a way to tell you the truth without putting you at risk." "I underestimated your strength, your right to make your own choices." His answer surprised her. The Kade she remembered had been confident to the point of arrogance, certain he knew best in all situations. This man before her seemed more reflective, more willing to acknowledge his mistakes. "The stew needs to simmer," he said into the silence. "I should finish the repairs to your corral while there's still daylight." As he moved to leave, Fiona found herself speaking. "I read your letters." He paused, his back to her, tension visible in the line of his shoulders. "All of them," she continued. They helped me understand why you felt you had to go, what you were facing out there." Kade turned slowly. "They were poor substitutes for the life we should have had." "Yes," she agreed softly. "They were." Their eyes met across the room, 5 years of separation hanging between them like a physical presence. "I'll be outside if you need me," he said finally, breaking the moment. Fiona watched him go, then moved to the stove to inspect the stew. The familiar domestic scene, a pot bubbling on the stove, The sound of a man working outside made her heart ache with what might have been. She set the table for two. A decision she hadn't consciously made until her hands were already arranging the plates and cutlery. When Kade returned as the sun was setting, she didn't send him away. They ate in a silence that gradually softened from awkward to companionable. Fiona found herself studying him when he wasn't looking, the new lines around his eyes, the scar along his jawline that hadn't been there before, the way his hands, always strong, now moved with a deliberate care she didn't remember. "The stew is good," she offered, breaking the silence. "High praise from the best cook in the territory," he replied with a small smile. "I wasn't always. You might remember my first attempts at biscuits." His smile widened. "Hard as rocks. I thought I'd broken a tooth. You ate them anyway. I would have eaten dirt if you'd served it to me." The honesty in his voice made her cheeks warm. "You're different," she observed. Kade nodded slowly. 5 years changes a person, especially years like the ones I've had." He met her gaze directly. "You've changed too. There's a confidence about you now, a certainty. It suits you." "I had to find my own way," she said. "Learn to depend on myself." "I never doubted you would thrive, Fiona. You were always the stronger one." She shook her head. "Not stronger, just different kinds of strength." After dinner, Kade insisted on washing the dishes while Fiona dried them, the domestic ritual oddly comforting despite the years that separated them from the last time they had done this together. "I should go," he said when they finished. "It's getting late." Fiona knew she should let him leave, maintain the careful distance she had established. But something, perhaps the letters, perhaps Sheriff Miller's words, perhaps simply the solid presence of him in her kitchen made her hesitate. "It's a long ride back to town in the dark," she said carefully. "The old bunkhouse still has a bed. It's not much, but it's shelter." Surprise and hope flickered across his face. "Are you sure?" "I'm not saying I forgive you," she clarified quickly, "or that anything is resolved between us, but it's practical, and we have more to discuss." Kade nodded, understanding the boundaries she was setting. "Thank you. I'll be gone by first light if that's what you want." "We'll see," was all she could commit to. As she prepared for bed that night, knowing Kade was just a stone's throw away in the bunkhouse, Fiona felt a strange combination of turmoil and peace. His return had reopened wounds she thought had scarred over, but also offered the possibility of answers she had long craved. Sleep came easier than she expected, and with it, dreams of what might have been and what still might be. The dawn broke clear and golden over the eastern horizon, bathing Fiona's small ranch in soft light. She had risen early, half expecting to find Kade already gone, but the smoke rising from the bunkhouse chimney told her he remained. She busied herself with her morning chores, feeding the chickens, milking her cow, checking the vegetable garden. When she returned to the house, Kade was waiting on her porch, hat in hand. "Morning," he greeted her. "I've fed and watered the horses." "Thank you." She gestured to the coffee pot visible through the window. "I've just brewed a fresh pot if you'd like some before you go." Something like disappointment crossed his features. "You want me to leave, then?" Fiona hesitated. In the clear light of day, her decision seemed both simpler and more complex. I think we need more time to talk, to understand what happened and what happens next." Hope returned to his eyes. "I'd like that." They sat on her porch, coffee mugs in hand, watching the sun climb higher in the sky. The familiar landscape stretched before them, rolling hills dotted with scrub brush, the distant mountains a hazy purple against the horizon. It was the view they had once dreamed of sharing every morning. "Tell me about these 5 years," Fiona said finally. "Not just the hunt for Sutton, but everything." Kade took a deep breath. "It wasn't what I planned for my life, any of it. After the war, all I wanted was peace, a home, you." He glanced at her, then away. "The first year tracking Sutton was the hardest. We lost men to ambushes, to the elements. There were times I nearly gave up, nearly rode back here regardless of the danger." "What stopped you?" "The thought of Sutton following me, of him hurting you to get to me." Kade's knuckles whitened around his mug. I'd seen what he was capable of. Towns burned, families destroyed. I couldn't risk bringing that to your doorstep. Fiona nodded slowly, understanding the impossible choice he had faced. The second year, we tracked him into New Mexico territory, Kade continued. We were close, so close, but he slipped away again. That's when I began to fear I might never make it back to you. And the next 3 years, more of the same. Tracking, fighting, losing good men, gaining ground only to lose it again. He set his mug down carefully. I started to forget what normal life felt like, what it was to wake up without a gun in my hand, to fall asleep without posting a watch. The haunted look in his eyes made Fiona reach out instinctively, her hand covering his. It was the first time they had touched since his return, and the contact sent a shock through her system. "And now," she asked softly, "now that it's over." Kade turned his hand beneath hers, their fingers intertwining as if by their own will. "Now I'm trying to remember how to live again, how to be the man I was before all this, or maybe a better one." They sat in silence, hands joined, each lost in their own thoughts. A meadowlark called from a nearby fence post, its cheerful song at odds with the weight of the moment. "I built a life without you, Kade," Fiona said finally. "It wasn't the one I wanted, but it's mine. I learned to depend on myself, to make my own decisions." "I can see that," he replied. "This ranch, it's remarkable what you've accomplished. What I'm trying to say is, I'm not the same woman who gave you that ring 5 years ago. I can't go back to being her." Pain flashed in his eyes, but he nodded. "I understand." "No, I don't think you do." Fiona tightened her grip on his hand. "I'm not saying there's no place for you in my life. I'm saying that if we find our way back to each other, it has to be as the people we are now, not the people we were then." Hope bloomed across his features. "Is that something you might want?" To find our way back, Fiona looked out across the land she had tamed alone, considering her answer carefully. "I don't know yet, but I'm willing to find out." It was more than Kade had dared hope for. She could see that in the way his entire body seemed to relax, as if a burden had been lifted from his shoulders. "I won't rush you," he promised. "However long it takes, whatever you need from me, I'm here now, for as long as you'll have me." The sincerity in his voice touched something deep within her, a place she had kept carefully guarded for years. "You could stay," she offered, "in the bunkhouse. Help with the ranch while we figure things out." The smile that spread across his face was like the sun breaking through clouds. "I'd like that very much." And so began a new chapter in their story, not a continuation of what had been, but something different. Something that acknowledged the years and experiences that had shaped them into the people they now were. Days passed, settling into a rhythm that felt both new and familiar. Kade proved himself invaluable around the ranch, tackling repairs Fiona had been postponing, helping with the livestock, even expanding the vegetable garden. They worked side by side during the day, sharing meals and conversation, gradually rebuilding the connection that had once seemed severed beyond repair. In the evenings, they would sit on her porch, watching the sun set and talking about the years they had spent apart. Fiona told him of her struggles to keep the ranch after he left, of learning to negotiate with cattle buyers who tried to cheat her because she was a woman alone, of the satisfaction she found in creating something that was entirely her own. Kade spoke of the long hunt for Sutton, of the nightmares that still plagued him, of how thoughts of her had kept him going through the darkest times. He didn't hide the violence he had witnessed and participated in, but neither did he glorify it. It was simply the truth of what had happened, laid bare for her to judge. "I killed men," he admitted one evening, his voice low. "Not just Sutton and his gang, but others who got in the way. I did things I'm not proud of, all in the name of justice." "The war changed you," Fiona observed. "Even before you left, I could see it in your eyes sometimes," he nodded. "The war taught me to kill. The years after taught me the weight of it." He looked at her directly. "That's why I need to know if there's still room in your life for someone like me, someone with blood on his hands." Fiona considered his words carefully. The territory is a harsh place, Kade. None of us get through life here with clean hands. What matters is the heart behind the actions. And what do you see in my heart? He asked, vulnerable in a way the old Kade would never have allowed himself to be. She studied him in the fading light. I see a man who tried to do what he thought was right, even at great personal cost. A man who's trying to find his way back to something good. Her words seemed to touch something deep within him. He reached for her hand, bringing it to his lips in a gesture of reverence rather than passion. "Thank you," he whispered against her skin. That night, alone in her bed, Fiona acknowledged to herself what she had been slowly realizing over the past weeks. She was falling in love with Kade Blackwood all over again, not the memory of the man he had been, but the reality of the man he had become. The thought both terrified and exhilarated her. As summer gave way to early autumn, the dynamics between them shifted subtly. Their conversations deepened, their silences grew comfortable rather than strained. Sometimes, Fiona would catch Kade watching her with a look that made her heart race, but true to his word. He never pushed, never presumed. One crisp September morning, Fiona woke to the sound of unfamiliar voices. She dressed quickly and stepped onto her porch to find Kade speaking with 3 men on horseback. Even from a distance, she could tell by their posture and the badges glinting on their chests that they were lawmen. "Fiona," Kade called when he spotted her, gesturing for her to join them. "These men need our help." She approached cautiously, noting the grim expressions on the visitors' faces. Miss Montgomery, the oldest of the 3, greeted her, tipping his hat. "I'm Marshal Harding from the Tucson office. These are Deputies Ross and Fleming." "What brings you to my ranch, Marshal?" she asked. "We're tracking a gang that robbed the Prescott Bank 2 days ago," he explained. "They killed 2 people during the robbery, including a young woman. Trail leads this way." Fiona's stomach tightened with apprehension. "You think they're headed through my property?" "It's likely they're aiming for the border," Kade interjected. "Your ranch sits along the most direct route south." Marshal Harding nodded. "Blackwood here says he knows this area better than most. We could use his help tracking them." The implications hit Fiona like a physical blow. They were asking Kade to join another manhunt, to put himself in danger again. "I told them I needed to discuss it with you first," Kade said quietly, his eyes never leaving her face. The marshal cleared his throat. "We understand your hesitation, Miss Montgomery, especially given Blackwood's recent return. But these men are dangerous. 4 more days head start and they'll be across the border, beyond our reach." Fiona looked at Kade, seeing the conflict in his eyes. Part of him wanted to go. She could see it in the set of his jaw, the alertness in his posture. The lawman in him, the tracker, wanted to help bring these killers to justice. But he was waiting for her permission, unwilling to repeat the mistake of leaving without her blessing. "How long would you be gone?" she asked, her voice steadier than she felt. 3 days, Marshal Harding answered. 4 at most if the trail is clear." Fiona took a deep breath. "May I speak with Mr. Blackwood alone for a moment?" The marshal nodded, and he and his deputies moved away, giving them privacy. "You want to go," she said once they were out of earshot. It wasn't a question, Kade didn't deny it. "These men killed innocent people, Fiona, if I can help bring them to justice." He trailed off, then squared his shoulders. "But I won't go if you ask me to stay. Not this time." The sincerity in his voice, the deference to her wishes, this was not the Kade who had ridden away 5 years ago, making decisions for both of them. This was a man who had learned from his mistakes, who understood what was at stake. 4 days, she said finally. "Not a day longer. And you come back to me, Kade Blackwood. You hear me? You come back." Relief and gratitude washed over his features. He stepped closer, his hands coming up to frame her face with infinite tenderness. "I will always come back to you, Fiona. Always." The intensity in his eyes made her breath catch. For a moment, she thought he might kiss her, and realized with startling clarity that she wanted him to. But he simply pressed his forehead to hers, a gesture somehow more intimate than a kiss could have been. 4 days, he promised. She watched him gather his gear, check his weapons, and saddle his horse with efficient movements that spoke of years of practice. The marshals waited patiently, understanding the significance of the moment. Before mounting, Kade returned to where Fiona stood on the porch. He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small object, pressing it into her palm. "Keep this for me," he said softly. Fiona opened her hand to find her mother's wedding ring, the one she had given him years ago, the one he had carried throughout their separation. "Kade, I'm coming back for it," he interrupted gently. "And for you, if you'll have me." With that, he mounted his horse and rode away with the marshals, not looking back. Fiona clutched the ring tightly, watching until they disappeared over the ridge. The next 4 days were among the longest of Fiona's life. She threw herself into ranch work, tackling projects that required all her concentration, but her thoughts constantly drifted to Kade. Was he safe? Had they found the outlaws? Would he truly return as promised? On the morning of the 4th day, she woke at dawn and found herself unable to stay in the house. She saddled her mare and rode to the highest point on her property, a small mesa that offered a view for miles in all directions. There she waited, scanning the horizon for any sign of riders. Hours passed. The sun climbed high in the sky, then began its descent westward. Doubt crept in along with fear. What if something had gone wrong? What if he was injured or worse? Just as the sun touched the western mountains, casting long shadows across the land, Fiona spotted a lone rider approaching from the south. Even at this distance, she would know that silhouette anywhere. Relief flooded through her, so intense it made her dizzy. She rode down the mesa at a pace that would have been reckless under other circumstances, desperate to meet him. They reached each other at the boundary of her property. Kade looked exhausted, his clothes dusty from the trail, a bandage visible on his forearm. But he was alive, he was whole, and he had returned as promised. Without a word, Fiona dismounted and went to him. He slid from his horse and opened his arms, and she stepped into his embrace without hesitation. "You're late," she murmured against his chest, breathing in his scent, reassuring herself that he was really there, his arms tightened around her. "The last outlaw tried to make a stand. Things got complicated." He pulled back slightly to look at her. "But I made it back, just like I promised." "Are you hurt?" she asked, noticing how he favored his left side. "Nothing serious. A graze on my arm, some bruised ribs." His eyes never left her face, drinking her in as if memorizing every feature. "Marshal Harding sends his thanks. They got all 4 outlaws, recovered most of the stolen money." "I don't care about that," Fiona said honestly. "I care that you're here, safe." Something in her voice, in her eyes, must have conveyed the shift that had occurred within her during their separation. Kade's expression softened, hope dawning across his features. "Fiona," he began, his voice rough with emotion. "These past months being here with you, rebuilding what we lost, it's been more than I dared hope for. But I want more. I want everything we once dreamed of, if you'll still have me." She reached into her pocket and withdrew the ring he had entrusted to her. "I kept it safe," she said, holding it out to him, "just like I promised." He took the ring, his fingers brushing hers. "Does this mean—" "It means I love you, Kade Blackwood," she interrupted, the words she had held back for so long finally breaking free. "I loved you 5 years ago when you rode away. I loved you during all those empty years between. And I love you now not despite who you've become, but because of it." Joy transformed his face, erasing the lines of exhaustion. "I love you, Fiona. I never stopped, not for a single day." He slipped the ring onto her finger, not as a betrothal this time, but as a promise fulfilled, a circle completed. "Marry me," he whispered. "Not because of what we once were, but because of who we are now and who we can be together." Fiona looked up at the man before her, scarred by life, humbled by experience, yet still fundamentally the Kade she had always loved. "Yes," she answered simply. "Yes." His kiss was gentle at first, a question rather than a demand. But when she responded, wrapping her arms around his neck and drawing him closer, It deepened into something that spoke of years of longing, of promises kept despite impossible odds, of a future bright with possibility. As the sun set behind them, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Fiona knew that their story, which she had once thought finished, was only just beginning its most beautiful chapter. The wedding took place on a perfect October day, when the cottonwoods along the creek had turned golden, and the air held the first hint of winter's approach. It was a small affair, held on the porch of the ranch house with only a handful of guests in attendance. Sheriff Miller, who had known them both for years, Doc Patterson and his wife, the Wilsons from the livery, and a few neighbors who had stood by Fiona during her years alone. Marshal Harding made the journey from Tucson, bringing with him news that a commendation for Kade's service would be forthcoming from the territorial governor. Even Mrs. Peterson, who had once been Fiona's harshest critic for pining after that no-good drifter, attended with a gift of hand-embroidered linens and tearful congratulations. Fiona wore a simple dress of deep blue silk, ordered specially from a dressmaker in Tucson. Kade, clean-shaven and solemn in a new black suit, watched her approach with wonder in his eyes, as if he couldn't quite believe this moment had finally arrived. "Dearly beloved," began the circuit preacher who had arrived just that morning, "we are gathered here today to witness the union of two souls who have found their way back to each other against all odds." The ceremony was brief, but heartfelt, the traditional vows taking on special significance for a couple who had already endured so much separation and hardship. "For better or for worse," Kade recited, his voice steady as he slid a simple gold band onto Fiona's finger to join her mother's ring. "For richer or for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death do us part. With this ring I thee wed," Fiona responded, placing a matching band on his finger, "and pledge to you my faithfulness, my partnership, and my heart." When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, the small gathering erupted in cheers and applause. Kade's kiss was tender but possessive, a public declaration of a love that had survived the most severe of tests. The celebration afterward was joyful, with food and drink flowing freely, music provided by a fiddler from town, and dancing that continued well into the evening. Fiona found herself passed from partner to partner as the men claimed their traditional dances with the bride, but her eyes constantly sought Kade's across the improvised dance floor. "He's not going anywhere," Sheriff Miller chuckled as he partnered her in a lively reel. "The way that man looks at you, I'd say he's well and truly caught." Fiona smiled, watching as Kade conversed with Marshal Harding by the punch bowl. "We caught each other, I think." As the night deepened and the guests began to depart, Kade found her standing at the edge of the property, gazing up at the star-filled sky. "Happy, Mrs. Blackwood?" he asked, coming to stand behind her, his arms encircling her waist. The name, her new name, sent a thrill through her. "Very," she replied, leaning back against his chest. "Though I'm still getting used to the idea that you're staying, that this is real." "It's real," he assured her, his lips brushing the sensitive spot just below her ear. "And I'm not going anywhere, not without you, not ever again." She turned in his arms to face him. "Promise." In answer, he lifted her hand and pressed a kiss to the wedding band he had placed there hours earlier. "Till death do us part," he reminded her, "and I intend to make that a very, very long time from now." Their wedding night was everything Fiona had dreamed of during the long years of separation. Kade was both passionate and tender, rediscovering her body with reverent hands, whispering words of love and devotion as they came together as husband and wife for the first time. Afterward, she lay in his arms, listening to the steady beat of his heart beneath her ear, marveling at how completely her life had transformed in the span of a few short months. "What are you thinking?" he murmured, his fingers tracing lazy patterns on her bare shoulder. "That I never expected to be this happy again," she admitted. "After you left, I thought that part of my life was over." Kade tightened his arms around her. I'll spend the rest of my days making up for those lost years." She propped herself up on one elbow to look at him in the moonlight streaming through the window. "No," she said firmly. "We don't live in the past, remember? We move forward together." The smile he gave her was full of such love that it made her heart ache. "Together," he agreed. "That's all I've ever wanted." The days following their wedding settled into a rhythm of shared work and domestic harmony. They made plans for expanding the ranch, discussing which investments would yield the best returns, which improvements would make their lives easier. Kade brought skills and perspectives Fiona hadn't considered, while she contributed the deep knowledge of the land and livestock she had developed during her years of independent management. "We should build a proper barn before winter sets in," Kade suggested one morning as they inspected the property together. "Something that can withstand the heavy snows if they come." Fiona nodded, making mental calculations. "We have enough lumber from that stand of pines we cleared last month. And if we hire the Wilson boys to help, we could have it up in 2 weeks." "My thoughts exactly." He slipped an arm around her waist as they walked. "Have I told you lately how much I admire your business sense, Mrs. Blackwood?" she laughed, leaning into him. "Flattery will get you everywhere, Mr. Blackwood." Their partnership extended beyond the practical aspects of ranch management. In the evenings, they would often sit before the fire, Kade reading aloud from one of the books Fiona had collected over the years while she mended clothing or worked on the quilt she was creating for their bed. They talked of everything and nothing memories from their younger days, dreams for the future, observations about their neighbors and the changing territory around them. Occasionally, shadows would cross Kade's face, remnants of the darker years he had endured. On those nights, Fiona would simply hold him, offering the comfort of her presence until the ghosts receded. Similarly, he seemed to sense when she needed reassurance that he was truly there to stay, and would find small ways to demonstrate his commitment. A wildflower left on her pillow, a task completed before she could ask, a gentle touch as he passed her during their daily routines. Winter arrived with a vengeance that year, bringing snowdrifts higher than anyone in the territory could remember. The new barn proved its worth, sheltering their livestock through the worst of the storms. Inside their snug cabin, with a fire roaring in the hearth and provisions carefully stored, Fiona and Kade found a deeper intimacy in their enforced isolation. "I used to dread the winter months," Fiona admitted one evening as they lay tangled together beneath a pile of quilts, the wind howling outside their window. "The silence, the emptiness." Kade's hand traced the curve of her hip. "And now," she smiled in the darkness, "now I think it might be my favorite season." As spring thawed the land, bringing new growth and possibilities, Fiona began to suspect a different kind of new beginning was taking shape. The persistent fatigue, the subtle changes in her body, the cravings for foods she normally avoided all pointed to one joyous conclusion. She waited until she was certain before sharing her suspicion with Kade. On a mild April evening, as they sat on their porch watching the sunset, she took his hand and placed it gently over her still flat stomach. "We're going to need another bedroom," she said softly, "by next winter." It took him a moment to understand, but when he did, the wonder that spread across his face was a sight Fiona knew she would treasure forever. "A baby," he whispered, his voice breaking on the word. "We're having a baby," she nodded, tears of happiness blurring her vision. "Around November, I think." Kade dropped to his knees before her, pressing his face against her middle as if he could already hear the tiny heartbeat within. When he looked up at her, there were tears in his eyes as well. "Thank you," he said fervently, "for waiting for me, for forgiving me. For giving me this second chance at a life with you." Fiona cradled his face in her hands. "We've both been given a second chance," she corrected gently, "and I intend for us to make the most of every single day of it." He rose to kiss her, a kiss full of promise and joy and gratitude, a seal on the vow they had just renewed. The news of their impending parenthood spread quickly through the small community, bringing a steady stream of visitors bearing gifts and advice. Mrs. Peterson arrived with a handmade cradle that her late husband had crafted for their own children decades earlier. Sheriff Miller brought a tiny silver rattle that had been in his family for generations. Doc Patterson checked on Fiona regularly, pronouncing her and the baby to be in excellent health. Kade threw himself into preparations with characteristic thoroughness, adding the promised second bedroom to their cabin, crafting furniture for the nursery, and even beginning a series of carved wooden animals that he hoped their child would one day play with. "You're going to be a wonderful father," Fiona told him as she watched him sand the edges of a small wooden horse. "Patient, kind, strong when needed." He looked up at her, a vulnerability in his expression that few besides her ever saw. "I hope so. I never had much of an example to follow." It was true. Kade had rarely spoken of his own father, a bitter man who had died when Kade was still a boy, leaving him to fend for himself from an early age. "Then you'll write your own story of fatherhood," Fiona said confidently, "just as we're writing our own story now." The months of her pregnancy passed in a haze of anticipation and planning. Kade was attentive to her every need, sometimes frustratingly so. "I'm with child, not made of china," she protested one day when he insisted on taking over the milking because she looked tired. "Humor me," he replied with that smile she could never resist. "I missed the chance to spoil you properly when we were younger. I'm making up for lost time." It was difficult to argue with such logic, especially when delivered with such obvious love. As her due date approached, Kade arranged for Mrs. Patterson, the doctor's wife and an experienced midwife, to stay with them. The first snow of winter had already dusted the mountains when Fiona woke in the pre-dawn hours, a familiar cramping sensation telling her that their wait was nearly over. "It's time," she whispered to Kade, who was instantly alert beside her. The labor was long and difficult. Through it all, Kade never left her side, supporting her through each contraction, wiping her brow, murmuring encouragement even as fear for her safety clouded his eyes. "You're the strongest person I've ever known," he told her during a particularly brutal contraction. "You can do this, Fiona. You're doing beautifully." As the sun was setting on that November day, their daughter entered the world with a lusty cry that immediately captured both their hearts. "She's perfect," Mrs. Patterson announced, placing the swaddled infant in Fiona's arms. "Congratulations to you both." Kade sat on the edge of the bed, one arm around Fiona's shoulders, staring down at the tiny face of their child with undisguised awe. "Hello, little one," he whispered, gently touching the baby's cheek with one finger. "We've been waiting a long time for you." Fiona looked up at him, exhausted but radiant with joy. What shall we call her? They had discussed names but had never settled on one, wanting to meet their child first. Kade studied the infant's delicate features, the wisp of dark hair, the eyes that even now seemed to hold a hint of Fiona's determination. "Catherine," he suggested. "After your mother, Kate for short." Tears welled in Fiona's eyes at the thoughtfulness of his choice. "Catherine Hope Blackwood," she amended, "because she represents everything we hoped for during those years apart." "It's perfect," Kade agreed, his voice thick with emotion, "just like her mother." He kissed Fiona's forehead, then their daughters, completing a circle of love that had begun years ago with two young people full of dreams, had been tested by separation and hardship, and had emerged stronger for the journey. The years that followed brought changes both expected and surprising. Kate grew from a curious infant into a spirited toddler with her father's adventurous nature and her mother's stubborn independence. The ranch prospered under their joint management, expanding to include more cattle, better grazing land, and eventually, a second cabin for hired hands during the busy seasons. When Kate was 3, Fiona gave birth to a son they named James, after Kade's mentor from his early days as a lawman. 2 years later, another daughter joined their family, Elizabeth, called Ellie, with copper curls and a smile that could charm birds from trees. Through it all, Kade and Fiona's partnership deepened, weathering the inevitable challenges of ranch life, parenthood, and the rapidly changing territory around them. Arizona achieved statehood in 1912, bringing new laws, new settlers, and new opportunities. Remember when this was all open range? Kade asked one evening as they sat on their porch, watching their children play in the yard. Kate, now 16, was teaching 10-year-old Ellie to throw a lasso, while 13-year-old James practiced his roping skills on a wooden calf dummy Kade had built. "Barely," Fiona replied, leaning against his shoulder. "Everything's changing so fast. Automobiles, telephones. Mrs. Peterson tells me they're installing electric lights in the general store next month." "Progress," Kade mused. "Can't stop it, I suppose. Would you want to?" she asked, curious. He considered the question seriously, as he did all her questions. "Not all of it. Some changes make life better." He squeezed her hand. "But I'm glad we have this piece of land, this life we've built, a place where our children can grow up knowing what matters." Fiona followed his gaze to their 3 children, now collapsed in a laughing heap as the lasso lesson devolved into a tickling match. "We did well, didn't we?" she said softly. "Despite everything." Kade turned to look at her, his blue eyes still capable of making her heart skip a beat after all these years. The sun had etched more lines on his face, and silver threaded through his dark hair at the temples, but to Fiona, he was more handsome than ever. "We did more than well," he corrected, pulling her closer. "We wrote our own ending, a better one than I ever dared hope for." As the sun set over the land they had tamed together, casting long shadows across the yard where their children played, Fiona knew he was right. Their story, once seemingly cut short by fate and choices, had found its true path, winding through hardship and joy to this moment of perfect contentment. It wasn't the ending either of them had envisioned in their youth. It was better, richer, deeper, and infinitely more precious for having almost been lost. "I love you, Kade Blackwood," she whispered. The words as true now as they had been on their wedding day, as they had been when she first spoke them as a young woman with dreams too big for the small territory town. "And I love you, Fiona Montgomery Blackwood," he replied, sealing the promise with a kiss. "Yesterday, today, and all our tomorrows." In the golden light of that perfect evening, surrounded by the family they had created and the love they had reclaimed, their story continued, not ended, stretching into a future bright with possibility and hope.